And the inhabitants of this coastland will say in that day, behold, this is what happened to those in whom we hoped. And we, how shall we escape? Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and we are back onto Isaiah. We're going to tackle chapter 20 today. It's been a little bit of time since I did the last chapter, but this is an interesting and short chapter here that we have that's a little bit different than the other chapters in this section. We are in a section that is known as the oracles against the nations, or the oracles about the nations. This chapter, though, does not open up declaring that it is a Messiah like the other oracles in this section do. And unlike those oracles, we start with a very specific historical reference in this chapter. This chapter, in fact, seems very strongly grounded in a historical event. Perhaps it was included in this section later by editors who felt it belonged next to the other statements about Egypt and Cush, but it seems significantly different in both form and style from the surrounding material. But let's get into it. Starting in verse 1 here, it says, "In the year that the commander-in-chief, who was sent by Sargon, the king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and captured it." So we have some very specific things here. You'll notice that my translation says the commander-in-chief. Some translations will put a proper name here of Tartan, but it's unclear if Tartan is a proper name or a title like commander-in-chief. I went with the title in this translation. The word is unsurprisingly a loanword from Assyrian, which itself may have been a loanword from the Hurrian culture. The city of Ashdod, where this person comes to, is one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. The Philistines were a foreign people, probably of Greek origin, who came to live on the coast. They came into the land around the same time that the Israelites moved into Canaan after the time of Moses and the Exodus. They came in around that same time. The Philistines, we believe, were part of the sea peoples who came in and established a stronghold in several of the areas through that region. And particularly, they had 5 coastal cities in what is now known as the Gaza Strip. And these Philistines, of course, would have quite a bit of interaction with the Israelite people throughout their history. They had a different language, religion, and culture than the rest of the people around them, although by Isaiah's time they had largely assimilated and were very similar to the other surrounding cultures. But when they first came in, they were quite the foreigners. They, under the pressure from the Assyrians, would put pressure on Egypt to defy the Assyrians in a rebellion. This, in the year that Tartan came to Ashdod, when King Sargon of Assyria had sent him there, this refers to an actual historical event. In 714 BCE, the coastal city of Ashdod rebelled against Assyria. Sargon then dispatched a force against Ashdod under the command of Tartan, either a man or a person with that title. And this lasted about 3 years until 711 BCE. That rebellion was crushed, and its leader was taken prisoner, and the city was reduced to a subject status. So all of this leads one to suspect that precisely at this moment, Isaiah undertook this symbolic 3-year act that is spelled out in his following verses. Even though the prophecy is directed at the fate of Egypt and Nubia or Cush and not Ashdod, it seems that this corresponds with this rebellion from Ashdod, which lasted about 3 years before it was crushed. So that brings us to verse 2, where things start to get interesting. "At that time, the Lord spoke by the hand of Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, Go and loose the sackcloth from your waist, and take off your sandals from your feet. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot." This seems like the kind of thing that would get attention. Many people are uncomfortable with this description and have suggested that he was not entirely naked, just not fully dressed. There's really no justification in the text for that assumption. We also do not entirely know where this occurred. Some have suggested Well, given the nature of what this is, maybe this was in a more secluded setting, such as maybe just in the king's court. My thought is that it would seem to get cold at some point. And, I've lived in Jerusalem one winter and it snowed. Um, some have suggested that this was a demonstration that he performed occasionally over the course of 3 years rather than a continual state of undress that lasted 3 years. That certainly seems much more practical. We have to remember, though, that different cultures have significantly different views about this sort of thing. We should not impose our American modern prudish puritanical thinking on this other culture. After all, before we invented machines and child labor and sweatshops to produce the endless supply of clothing that we enjoy in our modern culture, it was much more common to own very little clothing, and people who were in impoverished conditions might have had no clothing at all. No one had even invented something like a bathing suit at that point, and there were frequently circumstances where nakedness was reasonably common, though there were also strong social protocols to provide a certain degree of privacy or single gender environments where this would occur. One might remember King David sort of violated these protocols from his royal rooftop, which apparently had views into otherwise private areas. And we all know what kind of trouble that got him in. We often think of the Middle East as having a very conservative culture, but in the modern Middle East, Israel has a fairly European vibe, and they have a very different view on modesty. And in the surrounding countries, such as Egypt, where extreme poverty is common, I actually had several encounters with public nakedness that took me a bit by surprise, mostly in how much it was accepted as unremarkable. Once in a small village in Egypt, there was a young lad, probably about 13 years old, and he was begging with nothing but a small piece of torn cloth in his possession. This was heartrending, but it was also the world that they lived in. And Isaiah makes comments about this sort of thing when he talks about clothing the naked, which he does in several places in the book of Isaiah. This is because that was a real part of their world. And so while we might think of this as embarrassing or even shocking, it might not have been that unusual a sight in their culture. Still, this is quite an odd story, and it really makes you question if you would have wanted to be a prophet with the kind of job description this seems to imply. But prophets making performative gestures as part of their prophecy is actually a well-documented tradition. Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 9 has him eating bread while lying on his side for a year. We don't know how literal that was, or if that was a thing that he did periodically throughout the year, which seems like it must have been the case. Jeremiah breaks a clay vessel and wears a yoke. Ezekiel likewise had to shave his beard and cut his hair. And nakedness was at least sometimes a part of prophecy, as there's also this strange story in 1 Samuel 19:24, where Saul strips off his clothes and prophesies all night long. But in all fairness, Saul doesn't seem to have been quite right in the head at that point, so it's hard to read too much into that. It is popular, in fairness here, to portray prophets as old men. And we aren't really sure of Isaiah's age exactly, but this seems to be only about 10 or 15 years after he was having children, so he might be in his 40s or so at this point. So you can imagine him as a nice, muscular young man in this state rather than an elderly geriatric person. Maybe that's better. Overall, as you read commentaries on this chapter, especially ones that originate from the 19th and early part of the 20th century, it's a great example of people who go to quite great lengths to find alternative meanings in the text based on the interpretive technique of, I don't want it to say that. I suppose we're all guilty of that sometimes, but it's interesting that the idea that someone was once naked 3,000 years ago is still causing people to be uncomfortable today. And that says a lot about how effective this approach apparently was. On a slightly different note, do prophets normally wear sackcloth? It's an interesting question, and we really have very little idea what the life of a prophet was like in this culture. It's also interesting to note that our English word sack actually comes from the same root and is pronounced basically the same as the Hebrew word sock. It's a complex linguistic history there, but I found that to be a fascinating thing that our word actually comes from Semitic roots. But moving on here, verse 3, then the Lord said, as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush. Remember now that Cush rules Egypt at this point under the 25th dynasty. So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian captives and the Cushite exiles, the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, the nakedness of Egypt. So the statement here, with buttocks uncovered, very interesting, unique statement here. The word for uncovered is kasufi, and it only occurs here. And we actually think that the Masoretes got the vowels wrong on this, and that it should actually be a masculine plural construct, kasufe. It seems clearly derived from the root kasaf, which means to reveal, to expose, to strip bare. The word for buttocks is shet, and it is only used in this sense here and also in the odd story in 1 Samuel 10:4. There are a few other places where this word shows up, but there it means seat or foundation or base. In this sense, it seems like it would be somewhat analogous to our English word bottom in its range of meanings. Interestingly, we had this very same word, shet, in the last chapter in a very hard to translate verse in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 10, where some translations translate it as her foundations. I, however, followed other scholars who amended that to an entirely different word, meaning her weavers. And we think that it was not really the same word that was there. And I think that is just a coincidence, because I can't see any relationship between its usage here in this chapter and its usage in that previous chapter. But it does make you wonder a little bit with Isaiah, who likes to connect themes through the use of key vocabulary words. And that chapter was also a message of doom to Egypt. Is there a connection intended? Is there not? If there is, I don't see what it is. But then it leaves here as sort of a positive phrase almost here, the nakedness of Egypt, referring to the condition of these old and young that are being led away naked and barefoot, that they are the nakedness of Egypt. This term is both literal and figurative. The exiles are stripped of their garments and are literally naked, while the land's nakedness, a phrase that Joseph uses with his brothers referring to Egypt, means that which should not be exposed, or in this case, the shame of Egypt. And so we have the idea here that not just the people, but the very land of Egypt, the very nation of Egypt, is humiliated by this defeat and by this nakedness uncovered by the Assyrians, who put them into a state of imprisonment and servitude. Going forward here, then they shall be dismayed and ashamed because of Cush, their hope, and of Egypt, their boast. And the inhabitants of this coastland will say in that day, behold, this is what happened to those in whom we hoped, and to whom we fled for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria. And we, how shall we escape? It seems very clear here that Isaiah here and elsewhere in his writings does not want an alliance with Egypt. An alliance will occur, however. It's unclear to what extent that alliance would actually be beneficial to Judah during the siege of 701 BCE, but it is going to occur, and there is going to be a lot of military maneuverings involving both Assyria and Egypt that lead up to the great siege at the doors of Jerusalem. But this is a interesting dramatic note here at the end of this chapter here. How shall we escape? Showing the hopelessness of anyone standing up against the power of Assyria. They were such an overwhelming force. And so this very dramatic line brings an end to this chapter, which is one of the shortest in the Bible. But hey, it's not that big a deal, Isaiah. Size isn't everything. And with that, we'll see you in the next one. Please like and subscribe, and there'll be more to come soon. Thanks. Bye.